The night was heavy with gunpowder smoke, and the air itself seemed to tremble under the thunder of cannon fire. You can almost hear it now, the rattle of musketry echoing through the dark, men shouting orders, some crying out in pain, and the ground shaking beneath iron wheels of artillery dragged into position. Imagine standing there, in the midst of the Battle of Antietam, in the year 1862, where nearly 23,000 men would fall in a single day. You would not know who would survive until the smoke cleared, and yet each soldier carried on, loading another round, fixing another bayonet, stepping forward as if history itself demanded it. Welcome to History in Ashes. Here we bring the past to life in ways that remind you that history is not just names and dates. It is the choices, the mistakes, and the quiet struggles of ordinary people that shape the world you now live in. And before we march further, let me ask something simple of you. Could you pause for just a moment, scroll down to the comments, and tell us where you're watching from, and maybe what time it is there? It is always fascinating to see history itself connecting across places and hours. And while you're there, think about subscribing to this channel. After all, during the Civil War, men had to enlist for 3 long years. But all I am asking from you is the quick tap of one button, much less risky and far less likely to end with a cannonball. We upload a new historical story every single day, and I promise you, some of the most overlooked but important details are yet to come. Now, let's step back for a moment, away from the smoke of Antietam, and ask ourselves, how did the United States reach the point where citizens raised muskets against their neighbors? The Civil War did not come out of nowhere. For decades before the first shot was fired at Fort Sumter in April of 1861, the young American nation was already a patchwork of tensions and contradictions. At its core, it was a country built on liberty, while simultaneously built on slavery. And this contradiction grew wider with every passing decade. The North was industrializing, building railroads, factories, and cities filled with immigrant workers who spoke dozens of languages. The South, by contrast, remained rooted in agriculture, depending heavily on cotton and enslaved labor. To understand the Civil War, you have to understand this division not just in ideals, but in daily life. A farmer in South Carolina might live on land that had been tilled by generations of enslaved workers, while a factory hand in Massachusetts worked 14-hour shifts in mills where machinery roared so loudly that hearing loss was common. These lives barely resembled each other, yet both were tied together in one nation. The line between these two worlds had been patched and repatched with compromises. In the early 19th century, Congress tried to keep balance between free states and slave states. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 admitted Missouri as a slave state and Maine as a free state, carefully keeping the numbers equal in the Senate. Decades later, the Compromise of 1850 tried again, introducing the controversial Fugitive Slave Act, which forced even Northerners to return escaped enslaved people to the South. Laws like these didn't calm the divisions, they deepened them. Imagine living in Ohio in the 1850s, seeing a man escape chains, and then being told you were legally required to hand him back. That was the reality ordinary citizens faced. And then came the storm of politics. Abraham Lincoln, elected in 1860 as the first Republican president, represented to the South the victory of an anti-slavery movement that could not be ignored. Lincoln himself was cautious. His campaign promised not to abolish slavery where it already existed, but the South saw his election as proof that their way of life was under threat. One by one, Southern states seceded, declaring themselves no longer part of the Union. South Carolina went first, followed by Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. This act of secession was not simply politics, it was survival, at least in the eyes of those leaders. The Confederacy was born not with the unanimous will of every citizen, but through conventions dominated by elites who had the most to lose if slavery was dismantled. Here, the boring but important detail is this. The Confederacy was not inevitable. It required meetings, votes, legal maneuvers, and even moments of hesitation. In some towns, ordinary people protested leaving the Union. But in the halls of state power, the decision had already been made. The Union, for its part, was not immediately united in response. Many in the North thought, "Let the South go, why fight to keep them?" But Lincoln, a lawyer deeply committed to the Constitution, believed the Union must endure. To him, secession was not a right but a rebellion, and to allow it would destroy the experiment of democracy itself. The spark came at Fort Sumter, a federal fort sitting in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina, when Confederate forces demanded its surrender and Union troops refused. Cannons opened fire on April 12, 1861. The bombardment lasted more than 30 hours until the Union finally surrendered the fort. No one was killed in the battle itself, but the message was clear. War had begun. At this point, enlistments surged. In the North, men volunteered in massive numbers, sometimes marching off to war with brand new uniforms that had never seen mud or blood. Bands played, flags waved, and families believed the conflict would be short. In the South, a similar wave of enlistments filled Confederate ranks. Many believed one great battle would decide everything. Yet what awaited them was 4 long years of hardship that would test not just armies but entire societies. Consider this detail, often overlooked. The Civil War was fought not just with rifles and cannons, but with ledgers, railroads, and supply chains. A Union officer once remarked that moving bread was as important as moving bullets. Railroads carried troops across distances that would have taken weeks to march. Telegraph wires stretched across fields, delivering orders in minutes instead of days. But these same advantages also became weaknesses. A broken rail line or cut telegraph wire could throw entire campaigns into confusion. At the same time, both sides underestimated the human cost. Disease would kill more soldiers than battle dysentery, typhoid, measles, and infections from wounds that in modern times could be treated easily. A soldier might survive Antietam's hail of bullets, only to die weeks later from a fever caught in camp. Families sent letters back and forth, waiting weeks for news, clinging to scraps of handwriting as their only thread of connection. If you place yourself in that world, you find that the Civil War was not just about generals and presidents, but about people learning to endure. Women stepped into new roles, running farms, sewing uniforms, and even serving as nurses on battlefields where the smell of gangrene was overwhelming. Enslaved people made choices that reshaped history, fleeing plantations, joining Union lines, or resisting quietly by slowing work. Immigrant soldiers filled Union ranks, Germans and Irishmen who barely spoke English but fought under the American flag for promises of wages and belonging. All of this began from the smoke of Fort Sumter and the ideal that a nation must remain united. Yet every volley fired raised new questions. Could liberty survive divided? Could a nation half slave and half free endure? Or was the war destined to tear it apart beyond repair? The answers would come slowly, across years of blood, through the decisions of ordinary men and women who, in moments of hunger, fear, or exhaustion, still carried on. And so, standing again in that smoke at Antietam where we began, ask yourself what drove these men forward, step after step, into the mouth of cannons and the roar of muskets. Was it loyalty, fear, duty, or simply the momentum of history sweeping them along? If you step back from the roar of muskets and cannon fire, and instead place yourself in the quieter decades before the Civil War, you will find a nation constantly negotiating with itself. The United States in the early 19th century was young, restless, and uncertain of its identity. On paper, it was a republic built upon the ideals of freedom and democracy, but in practice, it carried within it the deep contradiction of slavery. That contradiction was not hidden. It was debated openly, patched over with political compromises, and tolerated as a necessary evil by some and as a sacred right by others. To understand how the Union fractured, you need to picture not just the loud speeches in Congress, but the daily realities that shaped the beliefs of ordinary Americans. Imagine walking through a northern city like Boston or Philadelphia in the 1830s. The streets echoed with the clang of hammers on iron, the rattle of carriage wheels, and the chatter of newly arrived immigrants searching for work. Factories filled the air with smoke, and docks buzzed with trade from across the Atlantic. The North was becoming a society of wage labor, fast-moving railroads, and industrial output. Now, picture the South during the same years. You would find sprawling plantations of cotton and tobacco, stretching across states like Virginia, Mississippi, and Georgia. Work was performed not by wage laborers, but by enslaved men and women who had no legal freedom, whose children could be sold away, whose lives were measured in output rather than liberty. The wealth of the South was built on their labor, and the ruling class of planters defended this system fiercely, not only as an economic necessity but as a cultural identity. These were not small differences. They shaped everything from how people worked to how they worshipped, how they raised families, and how they envisioned the future of the country. While a northern businessman might see progress in steam engines and textile mills, a southern planter might see progress in securing new lands to expand cotton production. And in a nation that was still expanding westward, the question became unavoidable. Would new territories be free, or would they permit slavery? Congress tried repeatedly to smooth these tensions. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 drew an invisible line across the map, declaring that states north of it would be free, and states south of it could allow slavery. It seemed like a simple solution, but lines on a map cannot erase beliefs, fears, or ambitions. 3 decades later, the Compromise of 1850 attempted another balance, admitting California as a free state while strengthening the Fugitive Slave Act. That law forced Northerners to participate in the capture of runaway slaves, even if they despised the institution. The effect was electric. Imagine being a shopkeeper in Ohio, watching a man run through the streets with chains still on his wrists, only to be told that you were legally obligated to help return him. These compromises were not signs of unity, they were signs of fracture. Each one was a temporary bandage placed over a wound that kept reopening, and every bandage left scars. Another factor often overlooked was the role of the press. Newspapers in the mid-19th century were not neutral recorders of events. They were partisan weapons. Southern papers defended slavery as ordained by God and vital to civilization, while Northern abolitionist papers circulated stories of brutality on plantations. Readers, in turn, consumed news that confirmed what they already believed. In this sense, America was not a single national conversation. It was 2 parallel conversations drifting further apart. You might also imagine the daily conversations in homes, taverns, and churches. For some, slavery was not an abstract issue, it was lived reality. Enslaved people resisted in countless ways, through songs that carried secret meanings, through escape attempts along the Underground Railroad, through work slowed down deliberately. Their lives were constant negotiations for survival and dignity. At the same time, poor white farmers in the South sometimes resented the planter elite, but still clung to the racial hierarchy that kept them above enslaved laborers. In the North, wage workers feared that freed slaves might compete with them for jobs, complicating the fight against slavery. The web of fears and interests was dense, and no easy solution could untangle it. The political stage reflected this. The rise of new parties, the Free Soil Party, which opposed the expansion of slavery, and eventually the Republican Party, which gathered those sentiments into a formidable force, reshaped the map of American politics. By the late 1850s, the old Democratic and Whig parties were fracturing. When Abraham Lincoln won the presidency in 1860, with no support from Southern states, it was not just a political result, it was a symbol. It showed the South that their influence on the national stage was waning, and they feared the next step would be the destruction of their social order. There is a detail here that may seem dry but mattered enormously. Population numbers. By 1860, the North had grown far larger in population than the South, thanks to immigration and urbanization. That meant more seats in the House of Representatives, more influence in elections, and more voices opposing slavery in national debates. Numbers on census sheets, quiet, bureaucratic tallies carried the weight of destiny. To Southern leaders, these numbers spelled out a future where they would be outvoted, outmaneuvered, and eventually outnumbered in every decision that mattered. In this sense, secession was not simply a reaction to Lincoln's election. It was the culmination of decades of demographic change, economic transformation, and cultural divergence. Each decade widened the gap, and by the time the nation reached 1860, compromise no longer seemed possible. Still, it is important to remember that the choice for war was not made by every individual. In southern states, not all citizens supported leaving the Union. In mountain regions of Virginia and Tennessee, resistance to secession was strong, and in some communities, families split bitterly along political lines. These smaller, quieter stories remind us that history is rarely unanimous. Decisions made in capitals often mask the divided loyalties within homes. Religion also played a role in deepening the divide. Churches themselves split, with Baptists, Methodists, and Presbyterians dividing into northern and southern branches over the issue of slavery. When even worship fractured, it was a sign of how deeply the issue had cut into the American identity. The question you might ask is this: could there have been another path? Could leaders have found a way to gradually abolish slavery, as other nations had done, without tearing themselves apart in war? Some argued for colonization, sending freed slaves to settlements in Africa, like Liberia. Others hoped for gradual emancipation paired with compensation for slaveholders. Yet in reality, the sheer scale of the institution, millions of enslaved people across vast states, made such solutions unlikely, and the passion of the arguments, fueled by decades of mistrust, made compromise nearly impossible by the late 1850s. When South Carolina seceded in December of 1860, followed quickly by other states, it was not just a political maneuver, it was the physical breaking of a fragile union that had never fully reconciled its contradictions. The act was both bold and desperate, a gamble that the Confederacy could stand on its own and that the Union would not resist. Looking back, the fragile American Union seems almost destined to fracture. But destiny is only visible in hindsight. At the time, men and women lived through uncertainty. A farmer in Kentucky might wonder whether to plant for the coming year or prepare for war. A dock worker in New York might wonder if trade would collapse. An enslaved man in Alabama might wonder if freedom was near or still generations away. These small daily uncertainties, multiplied across millions of lives, built the atmosphere of tension that eventually ignited into conflict. And so, the American experiment stood at a crossroads, half free, half slave, half industrial, half agrarian, deeply proud, and deeply divided. The balance could not hold forever, and the question that lingered was no longer if the break would come, but when. What do you think? Was there truly any chance for the Union to hold together? Or was the Civil War the inevitable outcome of contradictions too deep to mend? When you hear the phrase, political compromise, it may sound dull, like the endless wrangling of politicians behind closed doors. But in the first half of the 19th century, compromise was the fragile glue that held the United States together. Without it, the nation might have splintered long before cannons fired on Fort Sumter. Yet each compromise, while buying time, also deepened divisions, like a cracked wall patched with plaster that only hides the weakness beneath. Let us begin with the Missouri Compromise of 1820, one of the earliest great tests of unity. Missouri had applied for statehood as a slave state, threatening to tip the balance of power in Congress. At the time, there were 11 free states and 11 slave states, a perfect equilibrium in the Senate. To admit Missouri as a slave state without counterbalance risked giving the South more influence in national decisions. After months of heated debate, Congress reached a deal. Missouri would enter as a slave state, Maine would enter as a free state, and slavery would be prohibited in future territories north of latitude 36 degrees 30 minutes. On paper, the solution looked neat. In reality, it drew a literal line across the continent, announcing to the world that the nation was not united, but divided by geography and principle. Every new territory acquired would reignite the debate. Which side of the line would it fall on? For ordinary settlers pushing westward, this meant that the very soil beneath their feet carried political meaning. A farmer in Kansas or Nebraska was not just choosing land. He was stepping into the battlefield of America's future. The years passed, and the line began to blur. The Mexican-American War in the 1840s brought vast new lands into the Union, including what would become California, New Mexico, and Texas. Once again, the question returned with sharper teeth. Would these territories be free or slave? The answer came in another compromise, this time in 1850. The Compromise of 1850 was actually a package of laws, stitched together with the hope of satisfying both North and South. California would enter as a free state, tipping the balance toward the North. In return, the South received the Fugitive Slave Act, one of the most controversial laws in American history. It required that escaped slaves be returned to their owners, even if they had reached free states. Federal officials were empowered to arrest suspected runaways without a jury trial, and citizens were obliged to assist. For many Northerners, this law crossed a moral line. It meant that slavery could reach into their very streets. Imagine being a family in Boston, harboring a man who had fled from bondage, and knowing that federal marshals could knock on your door at any moment, backed by the law. It turned city neighborhoods into hunting grounds and placed ordinary citizens in impossible positions. Obey the law and betray a human being, or defy the law and risk punishment. In this way, the compromise designed to calm the nation instead poured fuel on the fire of abolitionist sentiment. Around the same time, another principle entered the stage: popular sovereignty. Instead of Congress deciding whether a new territory would allow slavery, the settlers themselves would vote. It sounded democratic, even fair, but in practice, it led to chaos. Nowhere was this more evident than in Kansas. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 repealed the old Missouri line and allowed settlers to decide for themselves. Pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces flooded into Kansas, determined to sway the outcome. The result was not peaceful debate, but violence burned towns, armed raids, and murders in what came to be called Bleeding Kansas. Newspapers reported the bloodshed daily, turning what might have seemed a distant frontier dispute into a national crisis. Here was democracy pushed to the breaking point, where ballots were replaced by bullets. It was in this same period that a man named Charles Sumner, a senator from Massachusetts, gave a fiery speech condemning slavery and its supporters. Days later, in 1856, he was beaten nearly to death on the Senate floor by a Southern congressman named Preston Brooks. The attack shocked the nation, not just because of its brutality, but because it occurred at the very heart of government. The chamber meant for debate and lawmaking had become a place of violence, a reflection of the country itself. Compromise after compromise, law after law, only seemed to push the nation closer to fracture. What is striking is how much of this struggle was fought in paperwork, in boundary lines, in votes, in obscure legal language. These were not grand battles with cannons. They were dry debates over clauses and borders. And yet, these debates determined who could own land, who could own people, and what kind of nation the United States would become. Ordinary Americans, too, felt the weight of these decisions in subtle ways. In the North, the Fugitive Slave Act meant that abolitionist societies grew stronger, organizing vigilance committees to protect escaped slaves. Safe houses on the Underground Railroad expanded, with entire communities risking fines and imprisonment. In the South, planters doubled down on their defense of slavery, publishing pamphlets and sermons, declaring it not only an economic necessity, but a divine institution. The battle lines were no longer just political, they were moral, cultural, and spiritual. Even the Supreme Court entered the struggle. In 1857, the Dred Scott decision declared that African Americans, whether free or enslaved, could not be citizens, and that Congress had no power to ban slavery in the territories. The ruling struck down decades of compromise, effectively opening all Western lands to slavery. For Northerners, it was a stunning blow. For Southerners, a vindication. But more than anything, it convinced many that the highest court in the land had chosen sides, and that the conflict could no longer be resolved through law. Through all this, compromise kept appearing as a solution, but vanishing as a reality. Each new agreement bought time, but never peace. The old guard of statesmen, men like Henry Clay, Daniel Webster, and John C. Calhoun, had spent their careers trying to balance North and South. By the 1850s, most of them were gone, and new leaders, less patient and more radical, filled the stage. The age of compromise was ending, and the age of conflict was dawning. It is tempting to look back and wonder whether more compromise could have saved the Union. Could a more generous deal, or a slower pace of change, have prevented war? Or had the contradictions grown too sharp, the moral stakes too high, for any paper agreement to hold? The answer is not simple, but what is clear is that compromise had become a word without meaning. Each law that claimed to preserve the Union only revealed more clearly how divided it truly was. And so, by the eve of Abraham Lincoln's election, the fragile balancing act had collapsed. The political center had failed. Moderation was drowned out by extremes. The question was no longer whether the Union could find compromise, but whether it could survive at all. What do you think were these compromises, noble attempts at unity? Or were they merely delays that made the eventual conflict even bloodier? Picture the autumn of 1860, a nation buzzing with anxious energy as ballots are cast for president. Newspapers thunder with headlines. Speeches echo across town squares, and in taverns men argue late into the night. The election is unlike any before. For the first time in American history, the entire South knows that the outcome may decide not just policies, but the very survival of their way of life. And into this storm steps Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln's candidacy was, in many ways, the product of the fractured political landscape of the 1850s. The once powerful Whig Party had collapsed under the strain of sectional tensions, leaving the Democrats split between northern and southern wings. Out of this chaos, the Republican Party had risen, uniting those who opposed the spread of slavery into the Western territories. Lincoln, a lawyer from Illinois with a gift for plain speech, became their standard-bearer. His appeal was not built on fiery abolitionist zeal. He was careful to promise he would not interfere with slavery where it already existed, but on the principle that slavery must not expand. To Southerners, however, this position was intolerable. Their economy and their political influence depended on new territories being opened to slavery. If expansion stopped, then slavery itself would one day wither. So when Lincoln's name appeared on ballots in 1860, many southern states barely allowed him to campaign, and in some he did not even appear on the ballot at all. Yet the fractured opposition handed Lincoln victory. With nearly 40% of the popular vote and a decisive majority in the Electoral College, he became the 16th President of the United States. But what is most telling is this: Lincoln won without a single Southern electoral vote. His support came entirely from the North and West. For the South, this was proof that they had become powerless within the Union. The reaction was swift. Within weeks of Lincoln's victory, South Carolina declared secession. In their declaration, they made their reasoning clear. They feared for the future of slavery. Their words were not about vague states' rights, but about the institution that underpinned their society and wealth. Other states quickly followed: Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. By February of 1861, Delegates from these states had met in Montgomery, Alabama, to form the Confederate States of America, electing Jefferson Davis as president. This was not a quiet process. In cities across the South, bells rang, cannons fired in celebration, and banners bearing the new Confederacy's emblem were hoisted. But in other places, hesitation and doubt lingered. Not every Southerner supported secession. In mountain regions, small farmers often felt little connection to the planter elite who drove the decision. Some communities openly resisted, their loyalty torn between Union and state. These cracks would later bleed into bitter internal conflicts, sometimes neighbor against neighbor. Lincoln, meanwhile, was still a private citizen, waiting to take office in March of 1861. During these months, the nation effectively had no functioning president who could respond to the crisis. Outgoing President James Buchanan declared secession illegal, but insisted he had no power to stop it. The Union drifted leaderless as state after state slipped away. In Washington, tension was palpable. Federal forts in the South suddenly found themselves surrounded by hostile forces. U.S. arsenals and mints were seized by state militias. In the halls of Congress, senators and representatives from seceding states walked out, leaving behind a body stripped of Southern voices. The once fragile compromises were gone, replaced by open rupture. Lincoln's journey to Washington for his inauguration reflected the danger of the moment. Traveling from Illinois by train, he passed through crowds that cheered him, but also through cities where whispers of assassination plots spread. In Baltimore, the threat was deemed so serious that Lincoln was smuggled through the city at night in disguise, a move that some ridiculed but that may have saved his life. When he finally took the oath of office on March 4th, 1861, the crowd that gathered listened not just to a new president, but to a man tasked with holding a crumbling nation together. Lincoln's inaugural address was firm yet conciliatory. He declared secession unlawful, but he also promised not to interfere with slavery where it already existed. His words carried both warning and reassurance. "We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies." But beneath the calm language, the crisis deepened. The Confederacy was organizing its government, raising armies, and asserting control over its territory. Lincoln faced a dilemma that might seem mundane but was in fact monumental. Federal forts. These small outposts, scattered along the southern coast, were symbols of Union authority. To abandon them would legitimize secession. To defend them might provoke war. Fort Sumter, sitting in Charleston Harbor, became the flashpoint. Its garrison, commanded by Major Robert Anderson, was running low on supplies. Lincoln had to decide whether to send reinforcements. He chose a cautious path, announcing that he would send only food, not weapons. But to Confederate leaders, any resupply was an act of defiance. On April 12, 1861, Confederate guns opened fire, bombarding the fort for more than 30 hours until Anderson surrendered. The first shots of the Civil War had been fired. The immediate effect was electrifying. In the North, Lincoln's call for 75,000 volunteers to suppress the rebellion was answered with enthusiasm. Men rushed to enlist. Bands played patriotic songs, and flags waved from buildings. In the South, the bombardment of Sumter was seen as a victory, proof that the Confederacy was real and willing to fight. 4 more states, Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina, joined the Confederacy, expanding its territory and resources. But the secession crisis was not simply a matter of states leaving the Union. It was also about the loyalty of individuals. Families were divided. Officers in the U.S. Army faced agonizing choices: would they remain with the Union or resign to serve their home states? One of the most famous, Robert E. Lee, declined command of Union forces and instead joined the Confederacy, despite his personal doubts about secession. His decision reflected the painful reality that loyalty was not always to a flag, but to a community, a state, a way of life. It is easy, looking back, to see the march to war as inevitable. Yet in those months between Lincoln's election and the firing on Fort Sumter, the future was uncertain. Could cooler heads have prevailed? Could the Union have allowed the South to go peacefully, avoiding the bloodshed to come? Or would that have destroyed the very idea of a nation built on unity? Lincoln himself believed the latter, that the American experiment could not survive if parts of the country could simply leave when they disagreed with an election result. To him, secession was not just rebellion, it was the undoing of democracy. And so the nation moved, step by step, from ballots to bayonets. What began as a political crisis had become a military one, and the compromises of the past were swept away in the roar of cannon fire. Yet even here, in these early days, there were glimpses of the long and painful road ahead. The enthusiasm of volunteers on both sides would soon give way to the grind of war. The belief in quick victory would collapse under the weight of long campaigns, and the fragile union that Lincoln sought to preserve would be tested in ways no one could yet imagine. So, as the smoke cleared over Fort Sumter, the question that hung in the air was not simply who would win the war, but what kind of nation would emerge from it, if any at all. Imagine standing on the seawall of Charleston, South Carolina, in the early morning darkness of April 12th, 1861. The air is damp with salt, the harbor calm, and yet a nervous crowd has gathered. They know something is about to happen. Out in the water, Fort Sumter looms, its brick walls sheltering a small garrison of Union troops under Major Robert Anderson. Inside the fort, men wait anxiously, low on supplies, aware that they are a symbol now. Then, at 4:30 in the morning, a single cannon shot arcs across the sky. It is the signal. Confederate batteries surrounding the harbor open fire, and for 34 hours, the roar of artillery shakes the earth. No one is killed in the bombardment, but history has shifted. The Union flag over Fort Sumter is lowered, and the Civil War has begun. The news spreads like lightning. Across the North, newspapers print the story in bold headlines. Crowds gather in city squares to cheer and sing patriotic songs. President Abraham Lincoln issues a call for 75,000 volunteers, asking states to supply regiments to put down the rebellion. Young men, some barely out of boyhood, rush to enlist. They come in mismatched clothes, carrying old muskets or nothing at all, but filled with confidence that the war will be short. In New York, Philadelphia, and Chicago, parades send regiments off to the sound of drums and cheers. Families wave goodbye, believing their sons will be home before Christmas. But the South answers with equal resolve. The bombardment of Sumter is celebrated as proof that the Confederacy has taken its place among nations. Jefferson Davis calls for volunteers, and tens of thousands step forward. Militias drill on courthouse greens, their officers wearing hastily tailored uniforms, their men carrying shotguns, hunting rifles, or whatever weapons they can find. 4 more states, Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina, join the Confederacy, giving it new strength. The secession movement, once limited, now spreads across the South like wildfire. The opening of the war is filled with enthusiasm, but also with illusions. Both sides believe victory will come quickly. Southerners, confident in their fighting spirit, believe that 1 or 2 decisive victories will convince the North to give up. Northerners, with their larger population and industrial power, believe that the rebellion cannot last. Few understand the scale of what lies ahead. 4 years of battles, sieges, and destruction that will leave hundreds of thousands dead. Daily life shifts almost overnight. In the North, factories begin producing uniforms, rifles, and ammunition. Women gather to sew flags and clothing for regiments. Churches hold special services to bless departing soldiers. In the South, families prepare to live without fathers and sons, and enslaved people quietly watch, aware that the war might bring a chance at freedom. On both sides, the first wave of soldiers carries not just weapons, but the hopes of entire communities. The early months of the war are marked by confusion as much as confidence. The Union Army is a patchwork of state regiments, each with its own uniforms, standards, and officers. Drills are uneven, discipline uncertain. Some regiments arrive at the front with bright plumes and brass buttons, looking more like parade troops than fighters. The Confederacy faces the same problems men brave but untrained, supplies short, weapons often outdated. Both sides are learning how to fight a modern war in real time. The first real test comes in July of 1861, at the Battle of Bull Run, or Manassas, as the Confederates call it. Thousands of Union soldiers, cheered on by crowds who followed them with picnic baskets, march out of Washington toward the Confederate Army. The expectation is simple: one battle to end the rebellion. But the reality is chaos. Under the hot Virginia sun, Union troops advance, push back the Confederates, and then collapse in confusion when Southern reinforcements arrive. The name Stonewall Jackson enters history as Confederate troops rally around him. Union soldiers retreat in panic, and the road back to Washington becomes a stampede. The shock of Bull Run shatters the illusion of a quick war. In the North, the defeat is sobering. Newspapers criticize generals, and families realize their sons may not come home soon. In the South, the victory fuels confidence. The belief grows that the Confederacy can stand firm against any Union assault. Yet beneath the triumph, practical challenges loom. The South has few factories, limited railroads, and a reliance on cotton exports that now face Union blockades. Its victory at Bull Run is glorious but fragile. Meanwhile, the war spreads beyond battlefields. At sea, the Union begins enforcing the Anaconda Plan, a strategy to blockade southern ports and choke off trade. Slowly, merchant ships from Britain and France, once eager for southern cotton, find it harder to bring supplies. In border states like Kentucky and Missouri, families are torn apart, neighbors choosing different sides, violence breaking out in towns and farms. In the mountains of Western Virginia, resentment against the Confederacy leads to resistance that will eventually create a new state, West Virginia. Small, often overlooked details reveal how the war began reshaping society. Post offices suddenly carry letters between soldiers and families across hundreds of miles, fragile lifelines of ink and paper. Railroads, barely decades old, become arteries of war, carrying troops and supplies at speeds unimaginable to earlier generations. Telegraph wires hum with messages between generals and politicians, though a single cut wire can plunge commanders into confusion. And through it all, disease begins its grim harvest, striking camps where men sleep 10 to a tent, drink from muddy streams, and eat spoiled rations. The opening months of the war also bring forward new leaders. Lincoln, cautious yet determined, studies military reports late into the night, searching for generals who can bring victory. In the South, Robert E. Lee, reluctant at first, emerges as a symbol of Confederate command. Ulysses S. Grant, a man dismissed earlier in his career, begins to rise in the Western theater, proving himself in smaller battles along rivers and railroads. These names, still unfamiliar to many at the time, will soon dominate the conflict. What is striking about the war's beginning is how much of it rested on confidence, even arrogance. Each side believed history was on its side, that God or destiny had chosen them. Yet each shot fired, each march begun, only revealed how uncertain the future truly was. The Civil War was not going to be a quick quarrel settled by one glorious battle. It was going to be a test of endurance, of resources, of societies pushed to their limits. So as the smoke cleared from Fort Sumter, and as men lay in the dust at Bull Run, the real question became clear. Not just who would win, but how much each side was willing to sacrifice, and how long they could endure the strain. And you, standing in that world, might ask yourself if you had been there, in April of 1861, would you have rushed to enlist with the cheering crowds, or would you have hesitated, sensing that this war was not going to end soon? If you had visited an army camp in the summer of 1861, you might have been surprised by how ordinary and chaotic it looked. Men drilled with wooden sticks because rifles had not yet arrived. They built tents from old blankets, cooked meals over smoky fires, and passed long hours playing cards or writing letters home. These were not professional soldiers at first, but farmers, clerks, teachers, and labourers, all adjusting to a new life. The great battles of the war were still in the future. For now, the challenge was simply learning how to live as an army. Rations often set the tone of daily life. A Union soldier's meal might be hardtack, those square, rock-hard biscuits that could last for years alongside salt, pork, or beans. Coffee became the lifeblood of the Northern Army, boiled black and bitter in tin cups, often mixed with grit from unwashed pots. Confederate soldiers had cornmeal, bacon when they were lucky, and parched corn when supplies ran short. They made a drink from roasted chicory root to replace coffee, though few were fooled by its taste. Food was basic, repetitive, and frequently spoiled, yet it shaped the rhythms of camp life as much as any battle. Disease proved deadlier than bullets in these early months. Typhoid, measles, dysentery, and smallpox swept through crowded camps. Medical knowledge was limited, and doctors often lacked even soap or clean bandages. A soldier might survive a skirmish only to die weeks later from an infected cut. Families, reading letters that spoke of illness rather than glory, began to realize that the war was not only about cannons and charges, but about endurance against invisible enemies. The armies themselves reflected the communities they came from. Regiments were often raised town by town, meaning neighbors fought side by side. A man might drill next to his brother, his cousin, or his childhood friend. This gave units strong bonds, but also meant that a single battle could devastate an entire town. One regiment's losses could leave farms without laborers, families without sons, and churches half empty. The war was personal because it reached directly into the structure of everyday life. Civilians, too, began to feel the weight of war. In the North, women organized aid societies, sewing uniforms, knitting socks, and gathering blankets for soldiers. They sent barrels filled with food, soap, and books to camps, sometimes including letters of encouragement to strangers in uniform. In the South, women took on new responsibilities as men went off to fight. They managed farms and plantations, oversaw enslaved labor, and endured shortages as blockades cut off supplies. A pair of shoes might be patched and repatched until the leather was thin as paper. Salt, once taken for granted, became precious, used carefully to preserve food. Enslaved people watched these changes with quiet intensity. Some fled to Union lines, becoming what were called contraband of war. Others remained, waiting to see whether the conflict would truly bring freedom. Their daily lives continued under harsh labor, yet the shifting presence of soldiers, the rumors of emancipation, and the chaos of war began to open cracks in the system of bondage. The Civil War, for them, was not simply a matter of Union and Confederacy, but a possible gateway to liberty. Amid these struggles, soldiers sought small comforts. They carved pipes from wood, whittled chess pieces, and sang songs by the fire. Letters home became their most valued possessions, read and reread until the paper wore thin. Some kept diaries, scribbling notes about marches, meals, and moments of fear. Others sketched crude drawings of their camps or battles, reminders that even in the middle of war, the ordinary urge to record and remember remained strong. Religion also filled the camps. Chaplains preached to crowds of soldiers sitting on stumps or logs. Hymns rose in the night, carrying across fields where tents flickered with candlelight. For some, faith offered strength. For others, doubt deepened as they saw suffering without clear purpose. The war tested not only bodies but beliefs. The small details mattered because they shaped the great movements of armies. A soldier too weak from dysentery could not march. A regiment missing its shoes could not fight. A family at home short of food might beg their son to desert and return. These mundane realities, dull compared to the roar of battle, decided outcomes in ways often overlooked. Even entertainment found its way into the camps. Traveling performers sometimes visited, giving plays or music to soldiers craving distraction. Newspapers circulated, though often filled with rumors or exaggerated victories. Soldiers cheered reports of their side's success, only to be disheartened when reality proved different. Morale swung as much with news and gossip as with cannon fire. The experience of civilians mirrored this uncertainty. In towns near the front, the arrival of an army meant sudden upheaval, fields trampled, barns emptied, fences torn down for firewood. Families learned to hide valuables when soldiers approached, unsure if the troops were friend or foe. In border regions, loyalty itself was uncertain. A neighbor who greeted you warmly by day might aid the enemy by night. Suspicion grew like a second shadow across daily life. The war's first year thus became a time of adjustment, of learning how to survive under new conditions. Men who had never marched more than a few miles now trudged for days with blisters and torn boots. Families who had relied on steady crops now faced shortages. Communities that once lived in peace now felt the pressure of divided loyalties. The romantic notion of a quick and honorable war gave way to the reality of long, grinding struggle, and through it all, one truth stood out. War was not fought only on battlefields. It was fought in kitchens, where food was stretched thin, in hospitals where surgeons worked with dull knives, in workshops where uniforms were stitched by candlelight. Every ordinary act, cooking, sewing, planting, writing, became part of the machinery of survival. So, when you think of the Civil War, not only remember the names of generals and the thunder of artillery, but also imagine the taste of hardtack, the sound of coughing in crowded tents, the sight of a mother darning socks by the firelight. These were the threads that bound the larger story together, often invisible yet essential. And perhaps the question for you is this: if you had lived then, would you have endured the hardship of camp life, or the struggle of keeping a household alive while the war consumed everything around you? By the spring of 1862, the war had already lasted longer than both North and South had predicted. The optimism of the first months was gone, replaced by the realization that this was not a conflict of quick victories but one of endurance. Armies swelled in size, stretching into the hundreds of thousands. For the first time, the scale of the struggle revealed itself: lines of blue and grey, marching across muddy roads, trains loaded with supplies clattering through the countryside, and rivers carrying gunboats that belched smoke into the sky. One of the earliest shocks came at Shiloh in Tennessee. There, in April, Union and Confederate forces collided in a battle so fierce that the fields and forests became soaked with blood. 2 days of fighting left more than 20,000 casualties. To give you a sense, that was more than all American wars combined up to that point. Soldiers wrote home describing the dead lying in rows, the wounded groaning in rain-soaked fields, and the unearthly silence that followed. The name Shiloh, meaning place of peace, became bitterly ironic. For the North, it was proof that the South could not be crushed quickly. For the South, it was proof that the Union had the will to fight on. Elsewhere, the Union turned its attention to the Mississippi River. Control of this great waterway meant control of commerce, supplies, and movement. Gunboats and ironclads pushed southward, bombarding forts and shelling cities. In April, New Orleans, the largest city in the Confederacy, fell to Union forces. The loss shocked the South, depriving it of a vital port and symbol. To everyday citizens, it meant occupation, Union troops marching through streets, new rules enforced, and the uneasy presence of enemy soldiers in their markets and churches. Meanwhile, in the East, General George McClellan led the Union's grand campaign toward Richmond, the Confederate capital. His Army of the Potomac, immense and well-drilled, crawled slowly up the Virginia Peninsula. McClellan was cautious, always convinced the enemy outnumbered him, and his hesitation gave Confederate defenders time to regroup. When Robert E. Lee took command in June, he proved bold, aggressive, and willing to gamble. The 7 days battles drove McClellan back, sparing Richmond. It was a moment when leadership mattered as much as numbers, and the South found in Lee a commander who could inspire confidence, even in desperate circumstances. Yet victories in the East did not erase the growing strain across the South. Blockades tightened, supplies dwindled, and inflation soared. Ordinary families paid higher and higher prices for basic goods, and whispers of hunger spread. In the North, politics grew tense. Some called for harsher measures, demanding the destruction of slavery as a war aim. Others wanted compromise and peace. The war was no longer simply about preserving the Union. It was slowly, painfully, becoming a war about the future of slavery itself. The single bloodiest day of the entire war came in September at Antietam near Sharpsburg, Maryland. The landscape of rolling fields, farm lanes, and a small stone bridge became scenes of unimaginable carnage. Cornfields were shredded by musket fire, a sunken road filled with bodies until it was called the Bloody Lane. The creek by Burnside's bridge ran red. More than 20,000 men were killed, wounded, or missing in just one day. For those who survived, the memory lingered like a scar. Civilians later walked the battlefield in shock, stumbling upon corpses still unburied, their farms turned into open graves. Yet, Antietam also carried political weight. Though tactically inconclusive, it halted Lee's invasion of the North. More importantly, it gave Abraham Lincoln the moment he needed. Just days later, he announced the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. Beginning January 1st of the coming year, enslaved people in rebelling states would be declared free. For millions of enslaved men, women, and children, this marked the first real step toward liberation. For the Union, the war now had a new meaning. It was not only about preserving a nation, it was about redefining it. The proclamation also shifted international politics. Britain and France, both considering recognition of the Confederacy, hesitated. To side with the South now would mean defending slavery, and public opinion in Europe made that increasingly difficult. The fate of the Confederacy thus became tied not only to battles in America, but to the winds of diplomacy overseas. Daily life continued to reflect these sweeping changes. In the South, shortages led to bread riots as women, desperate to feed their families, stormed shops and warehouses. In the North, industries boomed, but so did resentment over the growing human cost. Thousands of men lay buried in fields from Tennessee to Maryland, and thousands more filled hospitals where the air reeked of blood and carbolic acid. Newspapers carried endless lists of the dead and wounded. The scale of loss was nearly beyond comprehension. 1862 was, in many ways, the year the war lost its illusions. There was no quick victory, no honorable clash decided in an afternoon. Instead, it became a war of attrition, where rivers of blood, endless marches, and stubborn determination would decide the outcome. Generals learned, soldiers hardened, civilians endured, and the meaning of the conflict itself began to shift under the weight of events. And so the question hangs: was it the battlefield deaths of Shiloh and Antietam that defined this year? Or was it Lincoln's bold decision to transform the war into a struggle over freedom itself? The year 1863 began under a grey sky, with the nation still bleeding from the wounds of the previous year. Both North and South entered it with fatigue, but also with resolve. By now, the scale of the war was clear. Hundreds of thousands had already died or been maimed, yet the end seemed nowhere in sight. Families were living in a constant rhythm of waiting for letters, waiting for news from the front, waiting for husbands, sons, and brothers who might never return. On the first day of January, Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation officially went into effect. It did not instantly free every enslaved person. Its authority extended only to the states in rebellion, not the border states that had remained in the Union, but it changed the very soul of the war. Union armies now marched not only to preserve a fractured nation but to dismantle slavery in the South. Enslaved men and women, once forced into silence, saw hope written into law. Thousands fled plantations, seeking Union lines where they offered their labor, their knowledge of the land, and in many cases, their own arms to fight. This decision also opened the door for the recruitment of black soldiers into the Union Army. By the year's end, tens of thousands had enlisted, some fighting for freedom they themselves had been denied only months earlier. Their service was not equal. Unequal pay, poor equipment, and discrimination were rampant, but their presence on the battlefield was undeniable. Each musket they carried represented a living contradiction to the Confederacy's cause. The Confederacy, meanwhile, suffered from increasing scarcity, with Union blockades choking off ports and railroads breaking down under the weight of war. Ordinary citizens bore the greatest hardship. Women managed farms, struggled with inflation, and rioted in cities like Richmond over the lack of bread. Letters from soldiers home often carried both affection and guilt. They longed to be back, but knew their absence left their families to endure hunger and hardship alone. Militarily, 1863 saw some of the war's most iconic clashes. In May, the Battle of Chancellorsville unfolded in Virginia. Robert E. Lee, outnumbered, executed a daring maneuver, dividing his army and striking the Union forces from the flank. It was a stunning Confederate victory, but it came at a terrible cost. General Thomas Stonewall Jackson, one of Lee's most trusted commanders, was accidentally shot by his own men in the confusion of night. His death weeks later from pneumonia left Lee without his right hand. Southerners mourned deeply, sensing that even in victory, they had lost something irreplaceable. Encouraged by Chancellorsville, Lee made the bold decision to carry the war once again into Northern Territory. In late June, his army crossed into Pennsylvania, bringing the war to the doorstep of small towns and farms that had never expected to see it. The clash came at Gettysburg in early July, a 3-day struggle that would become the most famous battle of the entire war. The fields and ridges of Gettysburg turned into a vast killing ground. On the first day, Confederate forces pushed Union troops back through the town. On the second, savage fighting raged at places like Little Round Top, the wheat field, and Devil's Den names that would become etched into memory. On the third, Lee launched the desperate gamble of Pickett's charge, sending thousands of men across open fields under withering artillery and musket fire. The result was devastating. The Confederate assault was repulsed, their lines shattered, and the momentum of their invasion broken. The casualty lists were staggering: around 50,000 men killed, wounded, or missing over those 3 days. Civilians who had hidden in cellars emerged to find their farms destroyed, their homes filled with wounded, and their fields littered with bodies. It was said that the stench of death hung over Gettysburg for weeks, and farmers unearthed bones for years afterward when ploughing. For the North, Gettysburg was a desperately needed victory. For the South, it marked a blow from which they would never fully recover. At nearly the same time, far to the west, another struggle reached its climax. Union General Ulysses S. Grant laid siege to Vicksburg, the last major Confederate stronghold on the Mississippi River. For weeks, residents of the city lived in caves dug into hillsides to escape the shelling, surviving on mule meat and rats as food ran out. On July 4th, the city finally surrendered. The Mississippi was now under Union control from north to south, cutting the Confederacy in half. Together, Gettysburg and Vicksburg transformed the war. In the span of just days, the South had been stopped in the north and split in two along the Mississippi. The tide had turned, though the fighting was far from finished. In November, the war's meaning was crystallized in just a few short minutes when Lincoln delivered the Gettysburg Address. At the dedication of the new cemetery, after a long oration by another speaker, Lincoln rose and spoke fewer than 300 words. He reminded the audience that the war was a test of whether a nation founded on liberty could endure. He spoke of a new birth of freedom and government of the people, by the people, for the people. For soldiers still in the field, these words distilled the immense sacrifice into something larger than their own suffering. For citizens at home, they offered a reason to endure yet another year of loss. But the war was far from resolved. For every victory, there was still grinding struggle. Desertion grew in both armies. Draft laws in the North sparked riots, most infamously in New York City, where anger over conscription and racial tensions exploded into days of violence, leaving dozens dead. In the South, supplies ran thinner, morale waned, and the government in Richmond strained to hold together a collapsing economy. By the year's end, both Union and Confederacy had tasted triumph and tragedy, victory and loss. Yet the larger arc of the conflict had shifted. The Confederacy's hopes for recognition abroad were dashed. The North had momentum, leadership in Grant rising steadily, and the Emancipation Proclamation changing the war's moral landscape. Still, one question lingered. If battles like Gettysburg and Vicksburg had marked turning points, why did the war drag on for 2 more years? Was it simply the stubbornness of leaders, or the refusal of ordinary men and women to surrender a cause, even as the cost mounted beyond imagination? By the beginning of 1864, both sides knew they were locked in a test of endurance. The heady rush of early campaigns and daring invasions was gone, replaced by exhaustion, shortages, and a grim determination to keep fighting. More than 500,000 soldiers had already been killed, wounded, or captured. And yet towns still sent their sons to the front, women still gathered in aid societies to sew bandages, and politicians still urged that victory was just ahead, if only one more push could be made. The Union, emboldened by its victories at Gettysburg and Vicksburg the previous summer, turned increasingly to Ulysses S. Grant. In March, President Lincoln elevated him to General-in-Chief of all Union armies. Unlike some of his predecessors, Grant did not hesitate or shrink from the high cost of war. He believed that to win, the Confederacy's armies had to be continuously pressured, given no chance to regroup or recover. His vision was one of constant campaigns, squeezing the South on every front until its resistance collapsed. Grant's plan for 1864 was sweeping. William Tecumseh Sherman would drive into Georgia, aiming for Atlanta, the heart of Southern railroads and industry. Meanwhile, Grant himself would take command of the Army of the Potomac and face Robert E. Lee directly in Virginia. For ordinary Union soldiers, this meant months of relentless marching, fighting, and dying. They began to call themselves Grant's meat grinder, aware of the high casualties his strategy demanded. In May, the Overland Campaign began. In the tangled forests of Virginia, known as the Wilderness, Union and Confederate armies collided in a brutal, chaotic fight. Trees caught fire from the muzzle flashes of rifles, and wounded men burned alive where they lay. Grant did not retreat, as other Union commanders had after similar battles. Instead, he pressed on, moving south toward Richmond. The pattern repeated. At Spotsylvania, at Cold Harbor, at Petersburg. Each time, thousands fell, trenches grew deeper, and the war began to look like a precursor to the trench warfare of the next century. Cold Harbor in June left a particularly bitter mark. Union soldiers pinned their names on slips of paper to their uniforms before charging, knowing many would not return. In less than an hour, thousands lay dead or wounded before Confederate entrenchments. Grant himself later admitted regret for the assault, but he did not stop. His goal was to stretch Lee's forces thin, to force him into battles he could not afford. The siege of Petersburg that summer became a drawn-out stalemate, with soldiers on both sides digging in, building networks of trenches, and enduring miserable conditions of mud, disease, and hunger. Meanwhile, far to the south, Sherman began his march toward Atlanta. His army faced fierce resistance from Joseph E. Johnston's Confederate troops, who used delaying tactics and fortified positions. For months, the two sides maneuvered and clashed across northern Georgia. Civilians found themselves caught between the armies, their fields trampled, their homes looted or burned, their livestock seized. Sherman's advance was slow but relentless, and in September, his troops finally captured Atlanta. The fall of the city was not just a military victory but a political one. Back in the North, the presidential election loomed. War weariness was widespread. Casualty lists grew longer every week, and the Democratic challenger, George B. McClellan, the same General Lincoln, had once removed, ran on a platform of negotiating peace. Many believed Lincoln's chances for re-election were slim, but the capture of Atlanta changed the mood. It showed that the Union could and would achieve decisive victories. Lincoln won re-election in November, securing a mandate to finish the war no matter how long it took. For soldiers still in the field, the election results meant that the struggle would not end in compromise. It would end only with the surrender of the Confederacy. In the South, 1864 deepened the hardships already felt. The Confederate government struggled to supply its armies. Desertion grew as men left to care for starving families. Inflation made Confederate currency nearly worthless. Enslaved people continued to flee whenever possible, sometimes forming entire communities known as contraband camps near Union lines. These camps were overcrowded and disease-ridden, but they symbolized a profound shift. The very labor on which the Southern economy relied was slipping away. Sherman's campaign did not end with Atlanta. In November, he began his infamous March to the Sea. With 60,000 men, he cut a swath through Georgia, living off the land, destroying railroads, burning crops, and seizing livestock. His goal was not just to cripple Confederate infrastructure, but to break the will of its people to continue the fight. Southern civilians, who had often cheered the war at its start, now found it arriving at their doorsteps in flames. By December, Sherman reached Savannah, presenting the city as a Christmas gift to Lincoln. The psychological impact was enormous. For the Confederacy, it showed that even its interior was no longer safe. For the Union, it demonstrated that the end, though still bloody, was finally within sight. But for soldiers in the trenches around Petersburg, for prisoners in camps like Andersonville where thousands died of disease and starvation, for civilians scraping together meals from withered gardens, the war was not yet done. The new year of 1865 loomed, and with it the question: would the Confederacy finally collapse under the strain, or would it fight on to the bitterest of ends? The year 1865 dawned with the same cold determination that had marked the war for 4 long years. Soldiers, families, and entire communities had been hardened by suffering, loss, and constant uncertainty. In the Union armies, there was an unusual mixture of fatigue and anticipation. Men knew that the conflict could end soon, but they also understood that the Confederacy would not surrender easily. In Virginia, the siege of Petersburg dragged on through the winter. Trenches stretched for miles, connecting Union and Confederate lines in a grim tableau of mud, frost, and human endurance. Soldiers lived in dugouts, enduring freezing rain and snow. Disease claimed as many lives as combat. Yet General Ulysses S. Grant maintained relentless pressure, cutting supply lines and probing weak points. Every day that Lee's forces held the line, the strain on men, horses, and civilians behind the trenches grew heavier. Meanwhile, in the South, desperation deepened. Confederate citizens faced collapsing markets, near-empty storehouses, and armies whose needs far exceeded local resources. Rations were meager. Salt and flour were precious commodities, traded at exorbitant prices. Enslaved people seized opportunities to escape, and the very foundation of the Southern war effort began to crumble. Morale sank. Soldiers wrote letters home apologizing for their inability to send food or maintain order. Communities braced for the inevitable, yet clung to hope, as all human beings do. Farther west, Sherman advanced north through the Carolinas, repeating the methods of his Georgia campaign. Towns were burned, railroads torn up, and crops destroyed. The Union Army moved not just to fight Confederate forces, but to break the will of the South to resist. Civilians, seeing destruction arrive as a matter of course, often fled before Sherman's columns reached them, carrying what little they could save. Women, children, and the elderly trudged through forests and along muddy roads, a civilian army of survival accompanying the military one. In April, the pressure finally broke. Confederate General Robert E. Lee, encircled near Appomattox courthouse, realized his army could not continue. Exhausted, starving, and outnumbered, Lee surrendered to Grant on April 9th. The formalities were courteous, almost understated. Soldiers exchanged paroles, officers kept their sidearms, and the Union Army allowed the Confederates to return home with dignity. It was a surrender not of spirit, but of the reality that the Confederacy could no longer fight. Yet while Lee's surrender marked the end of major military operations, the war's human toll continued to resonate. Thousands of men were left homeless, families bereft of fathers, sons, and brothers. Towns across the South were ruined, and the infrastructure of a nation had been shredded. Refugees walked roads filled with debris and the echoes of cannon fire, while survivors of Andersonville, Belle Isle, and other prisons tried to return to ordinary life, carrying scars seen and unseen. And then, just days after the surrender, tragedy struck the nation in a profoundly different way. On April 14th, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated while attending a play at Ford's Theater in Washington. The president who had steered the Union through 4 years of unimaginable conflict was struck down, leaving a nation both victorious and leaderless. Mourning swept the country, North and South alike. Even among former Confederates, there was a recognition that the man who had preserved the Union and transformed its meaning through emancipation was gone. The assassination changed the immediate post-war period dramatically. Vice President Andrew Johnson assumed the presidency, facing the enormous task of reconstruction and reunification. The war had ended, but the questions of freedom, citizenship, and equality now confronted the nation with the same intensity as cannon fire. Formerly enslaved people, soldiers returning home, and families who had lost everything had to navigate a world radically altered, uncertain, and in need of rebuilding. Everyday life, which had been suspended during the war, slowly resumed, but the echoes of the conflict lingered. Soldiers returned to destroyed farms and cities, trying to reclaim property, rebuild houses, and find missing family members. Women who had kept households afloat discovered that their labor had been indispensable, reshaping social expectations. Enslaved men and women, now free by law, began to assert their independence, carving out communities, seeking education, and asserting political rights in a hostile environment. The Civil War, in essence, had transformed every facet of life. It had shifted the relationship between government and citizens, changed the meaning of freedom, and left a legacy of human endurance that would echo for generations. Yet in the midst of victory and reconstruction, questions lingered. How would a nation heal from 4 years of fratricidal struggle? Could reconciliation come without justice? How would the promises of emancipation be fulfilled in the face of entrenched resistance? And so, the final battles may have been fought, but the story of the war, the suffering, survival, and human resilience continued to shape every field, street, and household. Ordinary people, whose lives had been altered by distant generals and political decisions, now faced the challenge of living with the consequences. The war's lessons were etched in memory, in architecture, in letters, in cemeteries, and in the daily lives of those who endured. As you consider these final days, perhaps you ask yourself, if you had lived through the surrender at Appomattox, the chaos of Sherman's march, and the shock of Lincoln's assassination, how would you have begun to rebuild a life in a nation still very much at war with itself, in the heart and soul, if not the battlefield? The Civil War had ended, but the country was far from whole. In 1865, the guns fell silent, yet the wounds remained. Fields were scarred by trenches, towns by artillery fire, and families by the absence of fathers, sons, and brothers. Soldiers returned home, some to ruins, others to communities forever changed by the absence of men lost to battle or disease. The nation had won, but the real struggle, the struggle to live and rebuild, was just beginning. In the South, the landscape of survival had shifted dramatically. Formerly enslaved people began navigating a new reality, one that promised freedom but offered no security. Thousands moved toward Union lines during and after the war, creating communities known as freedmen's camps. Here, people sought food, shelter, and education. Teachers from the North arrived to establish schools, often facing suspicion or outright hostility from local whites. Literacy, once forbidden for many, became a symbol of independence and hope. Life in these communities was precarious. Supplies were limited. Disease remained a constant threat. Housing was often little more than crude cabins or tents, and work was necessary to survive. Yet, despite hardships, the determination of freed people reshaped the South. They sought to reunite families torn apart by slavery, register to vote where allowed, and negotiate labor contracts on more equitable terms. For the first time in generations, African Americans attempted to claim a measure of control over their lives. For white Southerners, Reconstruction was a period of bewilderment, frustration, and resistance. Confederate elites had lost political power, their armies defeated, and their wealth depleted by the war. The arrival of Union soldiers and Northern administrators to enforce federal policies was seen as occupation. Laws aimed at protecting the rights of freed people, such as the Civil Rights Act of 1866, met fierce resistance. Some communities resisted openly, while others sought subtler means to maintain social hierarchies, enforcing black codes and other restrictive laws. In the North, politics was dominated by a push for Reconstruction that would ensure both the survival of the Union and the protection of freed people's rights. President Andrew Johnson, who assumed office after Lincoln's assassination, struggled with Congress over the direction of Reconstruction. Johnson's more lenient policies toward the South clashed with the radical Republicans, who wanted to reshape Southern society fundamentally, secure the rights of African Americans, and punish Confederate leaders for their rebellion. Tension between the executive branch and Congress defined much of the year's politics. Ordinary citizens, too, felt the effects of these debates. Families who had sent sons to war waited anxiously for pensions, land, or other support. Northern industries, which had boomed during the war, now faced post-war adjustments as soldiers returned home, eager to work and rebuild. In the South, farmers attempted to plant crops in fields ruined by battle and blockades, often negotiating labor arrangements with freed people whose skill and labor were indispensable yet no longer coerced. Education became a central concern for freed people. Schools, often rudimentary and funded by missionary societies or the Freedmen's Bureau, offered literacy classes and basic arithmetic. Churches frequently served as educational centers as well, and teachers faced resistance from locals opposed to the empowerment of African Americans. Nonetheless, literacy rates began to rise, and reading, writing, and arithmetic became symbols of hope and progress. The Freedmen's Bureau itself was a remarkable, if imperfect, institution, established to provide food, clothing, medical care, and legal support. It also mediated labor disputes and attempted to secure land for freed people. It was a lifeline in a devastated society, though resources were always stretched thin. Agents sometimes clashed with local authorities or plantation owners, and the Bureau's limited reach meant that its influence was uneven. Yet it represented one of the earliest federal attempts to ensure social justice on a massive scale. Meanwhile, Southern infrastructure was in ruins. Railroads, essential for trade and communication, had been destroyed or fallen into disrepair. Cities like Atlanta, Richmond, and Charleston required years of rebuilding. Towns had to find new sources of fuel, food, and labor, while industries that had relied on enslaved labor scrambled to adapt. The physical recovery of the South was inseparable from the social and political transformations occurring simultaneously. As freed people gained ground, violence and intimidation grew in parallel. Groups such as the Ku Klux Klan began to organize, targeting African Americans and their white allies to maintain pre-war social hierarchies. Threats, beatings, and murders were intended to enforce fear and compliance, complicating efforts at reconstruction. Yet despite these dangers, African Americans persisted, voting when allowed, attending schools, building churches, and creating civic organizations. Every small victory represented both resilience and the deep tensions that would continue to define Southern life for decades. Northern soldiers who remained in the South played crucial roles. They enforced laws, protected freed communities, and attempted to maintain order. Their presence was sometimes welcomed, sometimes resented, and often resented intensely by those unwilling to accept the social changes that emancipation demanded. Their experiences reflected the broader struggle between idealism and practical realities, between federal authority and local resistance. In towns and rural areas alike, the ordinary routines of life gradually returned. Markets reopened, children went back to school, and families attempted to harvest crops and rebuild homes. Yet the war's legacy remained visible in every place. Fields bore the scars of trench lines, houses carried bullet holes, cemeteries were filled with the names of sons and fathers whose absence shaped every household. And over all of it hovered a question: could a society that had fought itself to near annihilation truly reconstruct itself in justice and peace? As 1865 progressed, the South began to reintegrate into the Union, though not easily. States were required to ratify the 13th Amendment, formally abolishing slavery, before regaining representation in Congress. Political debates raged, and former Confederate leaders were temporarily barred from office. Yet ordinary people, both black and white, had to navigate the day-to-day realities of survival, reconciliation, and the uncertainty of a new social order. In this period, human resilience was evident in every act. Freed people building schools, women managing households alone, soldiers returning home, towns reopening markets. All these were victories smaller than Gettysburg or Appomattox, but equally crucial. They represented the painstaking labor of rebuilding lives and communities in the shadow of immense loss. So, as Reconstruction began, the nation faced a question that was more than political. How could ordinary people, once enslaved, once soldiers, once civilians in a shattered society, rebuild a life in a world forever altered by 4 years of fratricidal war? How would memory, survival, and the lessons of suffering shape the generations that followed? By 1866, the United States was in a state of fragile transition. The war had ended, but the consequences reverberated through every town, farm, and city. The South, devastated by 4 years of combat, faced an economic collapse. Railroads lay in ruins, plantations were abandoned or destroyed, and traditional labor systems were gone with the abolition of slavery. Families struggled to feed themselves, rebuild homes, and adapt to a new social order that demanded negotiation and compromise. For ordinary citizens, survival was no longer a simple routine. It required constant adaptation to a landscape transformed by violence and legal change. The political framework of the nation was also in flux. Congress, dominated by radical Republicans, sought to reshape Southern society fundamentally. The Reconstruction Acts of 1867 divided the South into military districts, enforced voting rights for African American men, and required states to ratify the 14th Amendment to regain representation in Congress. The federal government, still asserting authority in an era of fragile institutions, became a daily presence in Southern life, overseeing elections, mediating disputes, and attempting to protect the newly freed population. Resistance was immediate and fierce. Many white Southerners refused to accept the authority of federal officials, perceiving them as invaders. Local governments often obstructed efforts to enforce civil rights, and groups such as the Ku Klux Klan emerged to intimidate African Americans and white allies alike. Violence became a tool to maintain pre-war social hierarchies, and fear shaped everyday life in countless communities. Simple activities, attending school, voting, running a business, could be dangerous for those challenging entrenched power structures. Despite this, African Americans pressed forward. They established schools, churches, and civic organizations. Freedmen's Bureau agents facilitated labor contracts that allowed for some measure of independence from former masters. Political participation increased, with African American men voting in elections, holding office, and influencing policy in some states. These advances were fragile, contested, and often temporary, yet they represented a profound shift in the social fabric of the South. Economically, the region faced immense challenges. Plantations that had once relied on enslaved labor now depended on sharecropping and tenant farming. Crops were often divided between landowners and laborers, leaving both parties vulnerable to shortages, poor harvests, and economic exploitation. Infrastructure reconstruction lagged. Railroads had to be repaired, ports reopened, and cities rebuilt from shelling and fire. Northern investors occasionally offered capital, yet mistrust and the uncertainty of local conditions slowed recovery. Survival required ingenuity, resilience, and a willingness to navigate new and often harsh economic realities. In northern cities, the aftermath of war brought its own challenges. Soldiers returned home seeking work, wages, and reintegration into society. Industries that had expanded to meet wartime demand now faced layoffs, and families who had relied on wartime contracts found themselves adjusting to peacetime economies. The country faced not only reconstruction in the South, but also the reintegration of veterans, a shift from wartime production to civilian markets, and the political question of how to memorialize the immense human cost of the conflict. The social consequences were equally profound. For women, the war had offered new responsibilities and authority in households, farms, and businesses. As men returned, traditional expectations reasserted themselves in some communities, while in others, the independence and experience gained by women during the war persisted, subtly altering social norms. Freed people, having tasted autonomy and organized communities, sought education, political participation, and economic independence, challenging the old social order in ways that would continue to provoke tension for decades. At the federal level, legislation sought to protect these changes, but enforcement was uneven. The Civil Rights Act of 1866 aimed to secure the rights of African Americans, guaranteeing citizenship and equal protection under the law. The 14th Amendment, ratified in 1868, codified these protections, ensuring that all persons born or naturalized in the United States were citizens and that states could not infringe upon their rights. Yet law and reality often diverged, leaving ordinary citizens to navigate a society in which legal progress was still fragile and contested. The economy of the South remained a daily struggle. Fields had to be replanted, often with labor that was unwilling or poorly compensated. Merchants dealt with inflation and shortages. Roads, bridges, and railways had to be repaired or replaced entirely. Communities relied heavily on mutual aid and family networks, often improvising solutions to shortages, destroyed homes, and disrupted commerce. For ordinary people, these daily acts of survival and reconstruction were as essential as the political battles fought in distant capitals. At the same time, cultural memory of the war took shape. Monuments, memorial ceremonies, and newspapers recorded events, battles, and heroism. For families, cemeteries and battlefield visits became places of mourning and reflection. Ordinary people carried these memories into daily life, shaping attitudes toward neighbors, former enemies, and the federal government. The war's lessons were embedded not only in law and politics, but in the rhythms of everyday existence, work, schooling, worship, and family life. Even as progress occurred, questions lingered. Could the South rebuild without deep resentment? Could the promise of freedom and equality be sustained in the face of entrenched opposition? How would a nation reconcile the ideals of liberty with the lived reality of decades of slavery and destruction? These were not abstract queries, but daily dilemmas for every person navigating the post-war landscape. The Reconstruction era of 1866 and beyond reveals the quiet, persistent labor that history demands. Political laws mattered, yes, but so did the choices of ordinary citizens. Farmers negotiating new labor contracts, freed people establishing schools, women running households, veterans returning to towns in ruins. Every small act of endurance, courage, and adaptation contributed to the slow rebirth of a society devastated by war. And so, as you imagine life in the years after the guns fell silent, consider this: which mattered more in the survival of a society, the battles won on the fields of Virginia and Georgia, or the unheralded, patient work of people rebuilding their homes, communities, and lives amidst devastation? By 1868 and into the early 1870s, Reconstruction had reached a critical stage. The immediate shock of war had passed, but the political, social, and economic consequences continued to ripple through every community. The federal government maintained oversight of the South, with military districts enforcing new laws, protecting the rights of African Americans, and supervising elections. Yet ordinary life remained a delicate balance of adaptation and resistance, with every act of survival intertwined with politics. In southern towns, resentment simmered. Many white Southerners viewed Reconstruction as an occupation imposed by a victorious North. The presence of federal troops, the enfranchisement of African Americans, and the removal of former Confederate leaders from office challenged established hierarchies. Local governments often resisted, enforcing discriminatory laws like black codes and later Jim Crow measures. Violence, intimidation, and terror, most notoriously by the Ku Klux Klan, became daily threats for those asserting their rights. Ordinary citizens, both black and white, learned to navigate this tense landscape cautiously. African Americans, despite dangers, pressed forward with determination. Freed people voted in elections, some holding office at local and state levels. Communities built churches and schools, cultivating education, literacy, and civic engagement. These achievements were fragile, often subject to backlash, yet they marked a profound transformation in Southern life. Everyday acts teaching children, registering voters, organizing meetings were revolutionary in a society that had long denied such autonomy. Economically, the South remained in flux. Sharecropping and tenant farming dominated the landscape, providing a precarious livelihood for both African Americans and poor whites. Crops were divided, rents paid, and debts often left laborers perpetually tied to the land. Small businesses struggled to reopen, cities rebuilt from wartime destruction, and infrastructure repairs continued slowly. Every day demanded practical problem-solving, clearing fields, repairing homes, negotiating labor agreements, and finding markets for produce. Survival was as much an economic exercise as it was a political one. In the North, political attention began to shift. War veterans returned to their towns and farms, industries readjusted to peacetime production, and the public's appetite for Southern oversight waned. Northern support for Reconstruction was never uniform, and by the mid-1870s, it began to fade. Federal troops remained, but their influence was increasingly challenged by local resistance and declining political will. Despite these challenges, Reconstruction left lasting marks. The 14th and 15th Amendments established legal protections for citizenship and voting rights, though enforcement remained inconsistent. Education expanded for African Americans, new institutions arose, and communities began to exercise political agency for the first time. These were concrete changes that shaped society long after federal troops withdrew, and Reconstruction formally ended in 1877. The war's legacies were visible everywhere. Roads bore scars of marching armies, Towns still held ruined buildings, and cemeteries grew with names of the dead. Veterans' organizations, memorials, and monuments became central to cultural memory, offering places of reflection, but also influencing how the next generation would interpret the conflict. Ordinary citizens lived with these reminders in their work, homes, and conversations, continually negotiating memory, history, and daily life. Socially, families adjusted to new realities. Women who had taken on significant responsibilities during the war retained new authority in some households, shaping both family and community dynamics. Freed people, newly literate and politically aware, pushed for inclusion, education, and economic opportunity. The choices of everyday citizens, how they farmed, traded, educated children, and interacted with neighbors, became the practical implementation of the new social order. Survival, in these years, required both vigilance and creativity, yet tensions remained unresolved. Former Confederates sought to restore their influence, while African Americans and their allies defended fragile gains. Violence, intimidation, and economic pressure were constant tools of control. Communities were divided, and the promises of freedom and equality faced repeated challenges. Ordinary acts of endurance, negotiation, and resistance became central to survival, often more decisive than battles fought decades earlier. By the late 1870s, Reconstruction's achievements were partially eroded but never erased. Southern society remained unequal, yet the fundamental transformation of American citizenship had begun. The experience of everyday people, black and white, northern and southern, demonstrated the long-term consequences of war beyond the battlefield. How human resilience, adaptation, and memory shape the course of history. As Reconstruction drew to a close, a question remained for every person living through these changes. How could a society reconcile the enormous losses, the shifting power structures, and the conflicting memories of war to build a future that was truly unified, just, and enduring? Could ordinary lives, shaped by endurance and survival, hold the key to a nation's rebirth? As the 19th century moved forward, the Civil War became not just a political or military event, but a defining element of American culture. By the 1880s and 1890s, generations who had lived through the war began to pass on their memories, shaping how the conflict would be remembered. For ordinary citizens, the war was not only a matter of battles and generals, it was lived experience, carried in letters, diaries, scars, and the very landscape itself. Veterans played a central role in this preservation. Organizations like the Grand Army of the Republic in the North and the United Confederate Veterans in the South created networks of camaraderie, remembrance, and mutual support. These groups held reunions, parades, and ceremonies, maintaining bonds forged in battle and ensuring that the sacrifices of ordinary soldiers were not forgotten. Veterans shared stories, some heroic, some tragic, transmitting lessons about endurance, leadership, and survival to younger generations. Memorials and monuments began to appear across the country, often funded by local communities and veterans themselves. In small towns, granite obelisks and bronze statues commemorated local regiments. In larger cities, elaborate monuments honored the dead, the wounded, and the collective effort of communities. Fields that had once been blood-soaked battlegrounds became sites of public memory, transforming spaces of violence into spaces of reflection. Families visited these sites, leaving flowers or wreaths, reading names etched in stone, and confronting the tangible cost of conflict. Ordinary people engaged with these memories in subtle but powerful ways. Women preserved letters and photographs, often creating albums that documented both private and public experiences of war. Children learned the names of battles, local heroes, and fallen relatives, embedding the war into family history. Farmers, merchants, and laborers carried stories into marketplaces, churches, and civic spaces. Memory was not imposed from above. It was lived and shared by the people who had endured, survived, and rebuilt. The war's legacy also influenced politics and identity. Veterans organizations lobbied for pensions, healthcare, and recognition of service. Memorial ceremonies reinforced a sense of community, loyalty, and historical narrative. In some cases, these narratives became contested. The North emphasized Union preservation and emancipation, while the South often focused on valor, loss, and the lost cause mythology. Ordinary citizens, especially those who had directly experienced the conflict, frequently found themselves mediating between these interpretations in daily life. Cultural memory shaped landscapes as well. Battlefields like Gettysburg, Shiloh, and Antietam were preserved, sometimes through public purchase, sometimes through private effort. Walking these fields, visitors encountered cannon embankments, markers for regiments, and the faint outlines of trenches and fortifications. For many, these sites were not abstract history. They were tangible reminders of suffering, endurance, and human resilience. Farmers ploughing fields, sometimes uncovered bones or artifacts decades later, forcing communities to reckon with the physical presence of the past. Literature, newspapers, and oral histories contributed to shaping public understanding. Memoirs by generals, letters published in local newspapers, and recollections of ordinary soldiers provided multiple perspectives. Some accounts emphasized heroism, others tragedy, others the minutiae of daily life, soldiers writing about frostbite, food shortages, and the monotony of guard duty. These boring but significant details, though often overlooked, allowed later generations to understand the practical realities of war, how men endured, how civilians survived, and how ordinary decisions shaped larger outcomes. Education also reflected this cultural memory. Schools began teaching the Civil War not merely as a series of battles, but as a formative national event. Civics, history, and social studies courses emphasized Union preservation, emancipation, and the consequences of disunion. Children learn not only names of generals, but also the lessons of human endurance, resilience, and adaptation. How survival often mattered as much as victory, yet this preservation of memory was not without tension. The South, in particular, wrestled with its identity after defeat. Monuments emphasized honor and sacrifice, sometimes masking the realities of slavery and oppression. Freed people and their descendants created parallel narratives, celebrating emancipation, resilience, and the building of communities under adversity. Ordinary citizens navigated these conflicting memories in daily life through conversation, teaching, and storytelling, often negotiating between the weight of history and the practical demands of rebuilding. For everyday Americans, the act of remembering was itself a continuation of survival. Families maintained cemeteries, preserved letters, and retold stories of hardship and courage. Communities held parades and dedications, blending public celebration with private mourning. The war was no longer just an event of the past, it became a living influence on identity, politics, and social expectations. In this context, ordinary people, not just generals or politicians, shaped the legacy of the Civil War. Their choices, what to preserve, what to commemorate, how to pass on stories, determined how future generations would understand both the brutality and resilience of this period. Memory became an active process, requiring effort, reflection, and negotiation, often more challenging than any battle fought in the field. And so, as you think about these monuments, letters, and community traditions, consider this. Is the true legacy of the Civil War found in the general's strategies, the battle's outcomes, or in the quiet, persistent efforts of ordinary people to remember, endure, and rebuild their lives amid the ruins of history? The echoes of the Civil War persisted long after the final shots were fired. By the late 19th century, the nation had officially reunited, yet the scars of 4 years of relentless conflict remained visible in every state, town, and household. The battlefields were no longer scenes of active combat, but they were etched into memory and landscape alike, reminders that human resilience often carries the weight of suffering alongside survival. Ordinary people, farmers, soldiers, women, freedmen, children, lived the war every day long after it ended. Their experiences shaped the social, economic, and cultural life of the nation. Families rebuilt homes, replanted fields, and navigated a society that had shifted politically, socially, and morally. Communities sought to memorialize losses while fostering continuity, a delicate balance between mourning and moving forward. Survival became intertwined with memory as people learned to live with absence, destruction, and uncertainty. The human cost of the war remained staggering. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers had died, countless others were wounded, and communities had been fractured across both North and South. The psychological burden of war persisted. Men carried the weight of combat, women, the anxiety of raising families alone, and freed people the challenge of claiming autonomy in a society still often hostile to equality. Every act of rebuilding, from reopening a school, repairing a railroad, to ploughing a field, was a testament to human perseverance. Politically, the Civil War reshaped the nation. The Union was preserved. The Constitution was amended to abolish slavery and define citizenship, and federal authority was reasserted in ways previously unimaginable. Yet these legal changes required constant enforcement, and ordinary people were often the ones ensuring that laws were implemented in daily life. African Americans exercised newfound rights in voting, schooling, and labor negotiations, asserting presence and agency in a society that had long denied them. Culturally, the Civil War became a lens through which Americans understood courage, sacrifice, and endurance. Veterans organizations, memorials, and commemorations allowed communities to honor those who had lived, suffered, and died. Families preserved letters, diaries, and photographs, passing stories of personal struggle to subsequent generations. Ordinary experiences, hunger, frostbite, long marches, caring for wounded relatives, rebuilding homes were as vital to the nation's history as the actions of generals and legislators. Economically, the South slowly began to recover, though disparities persisted. Sharecropping, tenant farming, and labor contracts shaped new systems of production. Cities rebuilt, railroads reopened, and markets adjusted to peacetime needs. Yet these changes required the ingenuity and endurance of ordinary citizens, whose daily labor made reconstruction tangible. Survival was an ongoing effort, integrating adaptation to both opportunity and hardship. The war also left a legacy of reflection and question. Generations asked how a nation so divided could reconcile. Could justice and freedom coexist with long-standing social hierarchies? How would memory shape identity, politics, and community life? Ordinary people navigated these questions quietly through the way they farmed, taught, organized, and remembered. Their lived experience became a repository of lessons for future generations, highlighting resilience, compromise, and moral reckoning. Even decades later, the landscape bore witness. Battlefields preserved as historical sites, cemeteries filled with gravestones, and towns rebuilt atop ruins reminded Americans that survival was inseparable from history. The lessons of endurance, adaptation, and human resilience were embedded not only in books or laws, but in the rhythm of daily life, how people farmed, educated their children, and passed on stories. As the nation matured, the Civil War's meaning continued to evolve. It was a story of victory and defeat, brutality and endurance, suffering and adaptation. Ordinary people, soldiers, civilians, freedmen, women, and children were the silent architects of its legacy, shaping a nation far beyond what any general or politician could achieve. Their choices, struggles, and acts of survival became the foundation on which a fractured country could rebuild. And so, as you reflect on the entirety of the Civil War, from its first battles to Reconstruction, from emancipation to memorials, ask yourself this: what is the true measure of history? Is it the grand strategies, the famous speeches, and the decisive battles? Or is it the quiet, persistent endurance of ordinary people who survived, rebuilt, and carried memory forward, ensuring that the story of a nation was not just recorded, but lived? History, it seems, is never just events. It is the human experience woven through time, the ordinary and extraordinary together, shaping the past we inherit and the future we imagine.